I remember that evening with a peculiar clarity, though Oxford often blurs days together in a continuous melancholy haze. The sky was a bruised lilac, and the last light lingered uneasily on the rooftops, as if reluctant to abandon the city entirely. Rain had fallen intermittently throughout the afternoon, leaving the cobbles slick and reflective, a shallow mirror of gas lamps and the dark outlines of college towers. I walked slowly, letting my eyes drift over familiar facades, noting the way ivy clung stubbornly to stone, like memory clinging to thought. The distant sound of a chapel organ, slightly off-key, trailed across the quad, more a lament than music, and for a moment I let it remind me of other evenings that had begun with equal quiet and uncertain expectation. It was on High Street that I first heard the whisper, nearly lost amid the bustle of returning fellows and damp umbrellas. Two women, speaking too softly for anyone else, mentioned a death at the King's Arms. They offered no names, only the kind of hushed elliptical comments one might exchange when fearful of being overheard. The words lingered, unnervingly precise, something unusual, something sudden, something that would unsettle the inn's careful veneer. I took note of the phrasing, though it was vague, for the human voice often betrays more than facts. The particular inflection suggested caution, perhaps guilt, or merely the delicate pleasure of observing fear. As I continued my walk, I allowed the city to speak to me in its usual, understated ways. A puddle reflected a half-hidden sign swinging gently in the evening wind. The shape of the letters reminded me, absurdly, of a cryptic crossword clue I had set aside that morning. Even in ordinary things, the mind searches for patterns, a habit I had never lost. I paused briefly to watch a cat slink along the base of a college wall, its movements measured and almost ceremonial. There was a rhythm in such small, unnoticed things that often proved more telling than the clamor of human speech. By the time I reached the corner near the inn, I had begun to formulate questions I would not yet voice. The King's Arms itself, though renovated recently, retained its venerable air, heavy oak beams, worn staircases, the faint must of old liquor and older secrets. I made a mental note of the door handle, polished but faintly scuffed, and of the way the window panes fractured the fading light into a mosaic of interior shadows. A guest passing hurriedly caught my eye. He moved with the precision of someone accustomed to concealment, and I filed him quietly, alongside the whispered remarks of strangers and the vague unease that had settled over the street. I did not yet know the details, but I felt the weight of expectation, the invisible threads that connect a place, a moment, and a forthcoming revelation. There is a subtle sort of melancholy that precedes the unraveling of a story in Oxford, a pause in which the city seems to hold its breath. That evening, the air was heavy with it, mingled with the faint, elusive scent of damp paper and cold stone. Even the gas lamps, flickering in the mist, seemed to nod in quiet acknowledgement, and as I stepped closer to the King's Arms, I knew, without yet knowing how, that something would require the kind of patience and attention to detail that Oxford itself demanded, and that I, in my habitual loneliness, would provide. I approached the King's Arms with the kind of cautious curiosity that Oxford instills in those of us who have spent a lifetime reading between the lines of stone and shadow. The inn's facade retained an old-world dignity, the polished oak of its entrance contrasting with the scarred brass of the knocker, as though past and present were quietly negotiating their coexistence. A faint scent of aged wood and something sweeter, perhaps the lingering aroma of a late dinner, wafted through the air. I paused briefly, noting the rhythm of footsteps along the flagstones and the half-glimpsed expressions of those entering. There was a subtle choreography to their movements, a careful measurement of attention and concealment, which always tells more than words. Inside, the renovated interior felt intimate, yet constrained, as if the walls themselves had absorbed every whispered conversation and careless laugh over the centuries. The low light fell in pools across patterned rugs and polished tables, catching the glint of glassware and brass fixtures. I let my gaze drift, noting the composition of guests: a man in a tweed jacket who examined the room as though it were a library, a woman with her hair meticulously pinned, fingers grazing the edge of a ledger in idle contemplation, and a younger man, nervous but observant, whose eyes lingered too long on every face. I filed them quietly in my mind, aware that appearances often mislead. I remember that evening with a peculiar clarity, though Oxford often blurs days together in a continuous melancholy haze. The sky was a bruised lilac, and the last light lingered uneasily on the rooftops, as if reluctant to abandon the city entirely. Rain had fallen intermittently throughout the afternoon, leaving the cobbles slick and reflective, a shallow mirror of gas lamps and the dark outlines of college towers. I walked slowly, letting my eyes drift over familiar facades, noting the way ivy clung stubbornly to stone, like memory clinging to thought. The distant sound of a chapel organ, slightly off-key, trailed across the quad, more a lament than music, and for a moment I let it remind me of other evenings that had begun with equal quiet and uncertain expectation. It was on High Street that I first heard the whisper, nearly lost amid the bustle of returning fellows and damp umbrellas. Two women, speaking too softly for anyone else, mentioned a death at the King's Arms. They offered no names, only the kind of hushed elliptical comments one might exchange when fearful of being overheard. The words lingered, unnervingly precise, something unusual, something sudden, something that would unsettle the inn's careful veneer. I took note of the phrasing, though it was vague, for the human voice often betrays more than facts. The particular inflection suggested caution, perhaps guilt, or merely the delicate pleasure of observing fear. As I continued my walk, I allowed the city to speak to me in its usual, understated ways. A puddle reflected a half-hidden sign swinging gently in the evening wind. The shape of the letters reminded me, absurdly, of a cryptic crossword clue I had set aside that morning. Even in ordinary things, the mind searches for patterns, a habit I had never lost. I paused briefly to watch a cat slink along the base of a college wall, its movements measured and almost ceremonial. There was a rhythm in such small, unnoticed things that often proved more telling than the clamor of human speech. By the time I reached the corner near the inn, I had begun to formulate questions I would not yet voice. The King's Arms itself, though renovated recently, retained its venerable air: heavy oak beams, worn staircases, the faint must of old liquor and older secrets. I made a mental note of the door handle, polished but faintly scuffed, and of the way the window panes fractured the fading light into a mosaic of interior shadows. A guest passing hurriedly caught my eye. He moved with the precision of someone accustomed to concealment, and I filed him quietly, alongside the whispered remarks of strangers and the vague unease that had settled over the street. I did not yet know the details, but I felt the weight of expectation, the invisible threads that connect a place, a moment, and a forthcoming revelation. There is a subtle sort of melancholy that precedes the unraveling of a story in Oxford, a pause in which the city seems to hold its breath. That evening, the air was heavy with it, mingled with the faint, elusive scent of damp paper and cold stone. Even the gas lamps, flickering in the mist, seemed to nod in quiet acknowledgement, and as I stepped closer to the King's Arms, I knew, without yet knowing how, that something would require the kind of patience and attention to detail that Oxford itself demanded, and that I, in my habitual loneliness, would provide. I approached the King's Arms with the kind of cautious curiosity that Oxford instills in those of us who have spent a lifetime reading between the lines of stone and shadow. The inn's facade retained an old-world dignity, the polished oak of its entrance contrasting with the scarred brass of the knocker, as though past and present were quietly negotiating their coexistence. A faint scent of aged wood and something sweeter, perhaps the lingering aroma of a late dinner wafted through the air. I paused briefly, noting the rhythm of footsteps along the flagstones and the half-glimpsed expressions of those entering. There was a subtle choreography to their movements, a careful measurement of attention and concealment, which always tells more than words. Inside, the renovated interior felt intimate, yet constrained, as if the walls themselves had absorbed every whispered conversation and careless laugh over the centuries. The low light fell in pools across patterned rugs and polished tables, catching the glint of glassware and brass fixtures. I let my gaze drift, noting the composition of guests, a man in a tweed jacket who examined the room as though it were a library, a woman with her hair meticulously pinned, fingers grazing the edge of a ledger in idle contemplation, and a younger man, nervous but observant, whose eyes lingered too long on every face. I filed them quietly in my mind, aware that appearances often mislead until one notices the overlooked gestural tremor of a hand, a pause in speech, a glance that does not belong. At the reception, a clerk offered polite words and the usual information about the rooms and amenities. I listened, not just to what was said, but how, registering the subtle hesitations and the way emphasis sometimes betrays what the speaker wishes to hide. A ledger lay open on the counter. I made a mental note of its entries, the neat handwriting and the curious absence of one particular name that I had expected to see. There is always something to be gleaned from what is omitted, the silent spaces as telling as the inked lines themselves. The staircase to the upper rooms creaked underfoot, a reminder that the inn was lived in, not merely presented. Each step seemed to echo slightly, carrying with it a sense of anticipation, as though the building itself held its breath in expectation of disclosure. From the landing, I caught a glimpse of a corridor where doors were half open, suggesting movement and secrecy. I paused to study a patterned rug at the threshold, the faint indentation betraying the passage of someone who had returned recently. Minor, almost trivial observations, yet in Oxford, the trivial often conceals the pivotal. I took a corner seat in the small lounge, allowing the room to settle around me. The low murmur of conversation, the scrape of chair legs, the occasional tinkle of a spoon against porcelain. A fire flickered lazily in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across a portrait of a long-forgotten proprietor. In that shifting light, it was easy to imagine that past and present were overlapping, that secrets lingered like smoke, visible only to those patient enough to watch. A slight misalignment in a painting's frame caught my edge of vision, an imperfection so small it could easily have been ignored. Yet it lodged itself in my mind, as subtle cues often do, waiting for context to emerge. By the time I settled in, the inn had revealed itself as more than a place of lodging. It was a stage for human intricacy, a vessel containing ambition, regret, and carefully concealed desire. And I, as ever, was the quiet observer, noting the elements that might one day coalesce into clarity. There was something in the air that evening, a faint tremor beneath the ordinary that suggested the ordinary would soon fracture, revealing both the delicate and the dangerous in equal measure. It was the faintest of disturbances that first drew my attention. A folded sheet of paper, edged with careful precision, lying almost unnoticed on the polished table of the inn's small reading corner. I picked it up with a sense of deliberate caution, noting the handwriting, deliberate, restrained, the sort of penmanship that suggests both education and a fastidious mind. The words themselves were few, cryptic, and yet carried an air of urgency that I could not dismiss. All is not as it seems beneath the lute. I read it twice, aloud to myself in a whisper, and even in repetition the phrasing felt disquieting, as though meaning were deliberately withheld, lurking between the lines. The letter offered no signature, no indication of sender or intent, yet something in the cadence of the words suggested an intimate knowledge of both the inn and its inhabitants. I traced the rhythm and spacing, recognizing a slight misquote from a 17th-century poem I had read in my youth. There is a certain pleasure in the deliberate misquotation, a hint that the writer expects the reader to notice or perhaps tests the reader's attentiveness. I made a mental note to cross-reference it with sources in the college library, though the thought of doing so added only to the gentle ache that such investigations always stirred within me. While I examined the paper, Lewis appeared in the doorway, holding a clipboard and a faintly anxious expression that habitually accompanies his presence. He spoke of the guests' questions answered, clarifications sought, and I listened, more to the intonation than the content. There's always more to be discerned in hesitation and emphasis than in factual statements. One remark, offhand and almost dismissive, pricked my awareness of a young woman commenting that she had seen a figure near the old service entrance, the phrase delivered as if she feared it would be overheard. Such moments are minor, easily forgotten, yet they resonate when placed beside other fragments of observation. I allowed myself to be drawn briefly into the mundane Lewis's systematic notes, the quiet shuffle of other patrons, the subtle creak of floorboards as a staff member passed behind the counter. Yet the letter persisted in the mind's periphery, an insistence, a whisper that suggested consequence. I examined the envelope for postmarks or smudges. Nothing of overt import, though a slight crease in the corner hinted that it had been carried in a pocket rather than sent formally. Such trivialities are often the first threads of understanding, waiting to be followed. A glance around the room revealed small, otherwise inconsequential details. A misplaced coaster beneath a teacup, the faintly askew angle of a chair, a bookmark jutting out from a volume of obscure poetry. Minor, almost imperceptible, yet capable of illuminating larger truths in due course. I paused to consider the psychological landscape of the inn, its guests and staff, each with motives both spoken and suppressed, each an actor in a narrative of secrecy, ambition, and concealed disappointment. It was within this lattice of restraint that the letter seemed most potent, a catalyst for the thoughts that would occupy me long into the evening. Later, as I returned the letter to the safe privacy of my coat pocket, I noticed a small detail that had evaded immediate attention, the faint indentation of words on the reverse side, suggesting another message, deliberately hidden or perhaps erased. It was nothing overt, barely perceptible, yet it lodged itself in my mind, the kind of subtle anomaly that often leads one to reconsider previously dismissed hypotheses. In Oxford, such minutiae are rarely meaningless. And so the evening proceeded, with the inn settling around us, its lamps casting soft shadows across polished surfaces. I felt in that quiet, measured moment the precise, almost imperceptible tension that accompanies the presence of concealed knowledge. The letter, modest in appearance, yet potent in implication, had shifted the weight of perception. It was now clear that beneath the routine hospitality and well-curated facades, something both fragile and dangerous waited, barely perceptible, for those patient enough to notice. Breakfast in the King's Arms had a peculiar quietude that morning, the kind of subdued atmosphere that seems to anticipate revelation without announcing it. I took my usual seat near a window, watching the rain-streaked light fracture across the tablecloth, observing the patterns of those around me with the patience instilled by years of solitary reflection. A waiter moved silently between tables, balancing a tray with the precision of a musician, while the murmured exchanges of guests provided the faintest undercurrent of tension. It is in such subtle cadences that a detective finds the first signs of character and concealment. My attention was drawn first to a man in a tweed jacket, seated with a journal open before him, the tip of his pen hovering over a page in indecision. He examined the room not for companionship, but as though cataloguing it, noting, perhaps, the positioning of chairs or the slant of a shadow. The careful scrutiny of space often mirrors the scrutiny of human behavior. I observed the slight flicker in his gaze when a maid entered, a hesitation that suggested an unacknowledged awareness of something beyond routine, and I filed it away quietly. Across the room, a young historian fidgeted with his cutlery, the polished silver reflecting fragments of the low-hanging lamps. His eyes darted from table to table, catching snippets of conversation and perhaps attempting to read intentions as one might decipher a line of poetry. It was the careful orchestration of nervous movements that intrigued me, a hand brushing against a notebook at irregular intervals, a sip of tea taken at the exact moment a question was implied. Each minute action contributes to a silent narrative, one often more revealing than words themselves. A woman with hair meticulously pinned observed the breakfast with serene composure, but the curl of her lip and the brief flick of her eyes toward a corridor betrayed the faintest irritation or perhaps a calculated patience. She seemed entirely in control of her expressions, yet control itself is a signal. The restraint and precision with which a person navigates ordinary moments often conceals the extraordinary, an undisclosed motive, a lingering regret, a secret observation. Lewis moved unobtrusively among the tables, posing questions with his habitual courtesy, eliciting facts from staff and guests alike. I listened not only to the content of his inquiries, but to the way replies were phrased, noting the particular phrasing of one guest who described the previous night's events in overly measured tones, emphasizing the orderliness of a situation that, in truth, seemed far from ordinary. It is in such emphasis, when someone stresses normalcy, that deception may hide. I allowed my gaze to drift once more, noticing a small, almost imperceptible detail. A footprint in the dust along the entrance hall, partially erased, yet visible enough to suggest recent passage. It belonged not to a guest who had arrived during the evening, but to someone already familiar with the inn's hidden corners. Details of this kind often flicker into meaning only when later connected to the behaviors already observed. As I sipped my coffee, the young historian's gaze inadvertently lingered too long on the woman with pinned hair, a subtlety that could signify admiration, resentment, or curiosity. The tweed-jacketed man occasionally looked up from his journal with a faint tightening of the jaw. Each of these minor gestures, slight, easily missed yet suggestive, began to coalesce into a pattern that demanded attention without revealing itself outright. These were my first suspects, not in any accusatory sense, but as points of observation around which the mystery began to crystallize. The morning light fell through the misted window panes, highlighting the quiet interplay of human behavior and ambient detail. Breakfast concluded without incident, yet the air retained the faint tension of anticipation. Even as I left the table and followed Lewis into the corridor, the details of those subtle movements, hesitations, and overlooked gestures lingered, suggesting that beneath the ordinary veneer of the inn, a complex web of motives had already begun to take shape. By mid-morning, the investigation seemed to offer a tidy, almost too convenient solution. Lewis had followed a line of inquiry that pointed steadily toward the young historian, the one whose nervous glances and fidgeting gestures had been so conspicuous during breakfast. On paper, the narrative appeared coherent. His past association with the deceased, the occasional lateness to lectures, the slight discrepancies in his account of the previous evening. The evidence, though circumstantial, had a neat symmetry to it, and for a fleeting moment I could understand why one might feel the case nearly closed. Yet something about the certainty of it grated against my sensibilities. I walked slowly along the corridor outside the lounge, the faint smell of wet stone and worn rugs mingling with the scent of polished wood and coffee. Even in the most logical of deductions, Oxford has a way of reminding one that neatness can be deceptive. A misplaced footprint in dust near the service door, the subtle smudge of ink on a ledger page, the precise angle of a chair left ajar, all whispering that the story was not as simple as it appeared. Lewis was polite but eager, delivering his report with the careful cadence of one who has convinced himself of the correctness of his conclusion. The historian, upon being questioned again, offered clarifications with measured tones, yet the tension in his hands betrayed the pressure of scrutiny. It was a textbook illustration of how circumstantial alignment can seduce the mind into premature closure. I observed, silently cataloguing the ways in which behavior might mislead, gestures that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on what one chooses to notice. I returned to the reading corner, picking up the anonymous letter once more. Its presence, quiet and insistent, reminded me that messages of significance often arrive as half-shadows, insisting on contemplation rather than immediate action. The misquoted verse, so subtle, had lodged itself in my thoughts, teasing a perspective that neither the ledger nor the historian's responses could account for. There is a peculiar sort of logic in Oxford that values ambiguity over certainty, and I felt its tug insistently. Later, I noticed something that had been overlooked in the preliminary review: a faint indentation on a sheet beneath the ledger, likely a note pressed and erased in haste. The historian had not mentioned it, nor had it been observed by Lewis. Yet its presence suggested that someone else had been there, making an intervention unnoticed by the casual observer. It was a small anomaly, almost trivial, yet capable of undermining the entire tidy solution Lewis had presented. The inn itself seemed to respond to this unfolding realization. Floorboards creaked in unanticipated ways, shadows shifted as the afternoon light angled through misted windows, and the subtle aroma of damp paper became almost a physical presence. In this setting, the notion of resolution felt premature, a veneer masking the deeper, more complex interplay of motive and opportunity. Even the historian's composure now struck me as rehearsed, almost too deliberate. Small behaviors, such as the way he paused before touching his teacup, or the slight hesitation when mentioning the previous evening's movements, offered the kind of understated cues that seldom lie. It was not proof of guilt, merely an indication that narrative simplicity often conceals richer, more intricate truths. I left the lounge quietly, allowing Lewis to continue his enthusiastic reporting, while I walked past the corridor where sunlight dappled the worn rugs, and the distant hum of Oxford streets entered through open windows. The case, at that stage, had settled into what appeared to be a logical conclusion. But logic, I knew, is sometimes a siren song, luring one toward an answer that satisfies the mind while eluding the deeper, subtler truth that only time and patient observation can reveal. The false resolution was in place, neat and plausible, yet I felt with quiet certainty that the story had only begun to unfold. The afternoon light filtered through the tall mullioned windows, pale and uncertain, casting long, fractured shadows across the lounge floor. I sat with the notebook open, but my eyes wandered more often than they recorded, following the gentle sway of curtains, the rhythm of a clock ticking somewhere behind a wall panel, the subtle shift of a guest's expression as they caught my glance. Oxford has a way of making one hyper-aware of the incongruities, the faintly off-key note, the misaligned shadow, the pause in speech that signals something withheld. It was a minor discomfort, the sort that quietly insists on attention, and I welcomed it. My thoughts returned to the letter and the diary entry I had discovered in the inn's library. Both were ostensibly discreet, but I began to sense a pattern in the discrepancies, the way one phrase in the letter repeated a misquotation, the way the diary suggested an absence rather than a presence. It was in these small incongruities that the first real insight often hides. I glanced again at the ledger on the counter, noting how one line originally overlooked a slight smudge, as if the writer had pressed too hard, hesitated, and then altered the notation. A momentary misalignment in handwriting can speak of hesitation, concealment, even fear. Lewis approached with the quiet efficiency he brings to observation, reporting minor clarifications. The young historian had explained the sequence of his evening, emphasizing his compliance and apparent detachment. Yet as he spoke, I noted the micro-expressions he failed to suppress: a faint tightening around the eyes, the brief contraction of his jaw. Small movements, almost imperceptible, but telling nonetheless. I compared them in my mind to the gestures of the other guests, the woman with the pinned hair, the man in tweed, and saw subtle divergences, rhythms that did not match the spoken account. Later, I examined a sheet of music left on a side table, the notation smudged at one corner. A single measure seemed misaligned, a note slightly off from the intended melody. It was minor, perhaps an accident, yet it bore the same curious echo as the smudge in the ledger, a subtle hint that someone had returned, moved, or corrected in secrecy. Music, like text, can conceal intention. It is in the slight alteration, the discrepant note, that hidden truths whisper. As the afternoon waned, I wandered the corridor leading to the upper rooms, where light pooled against the worn rugs. The young historian passed in the opposite direction, and in that brief encounter, his hesitation at a doorway, the subtle recoil, almost imperceptible, spoke of anticipation, perhaps apprehension. It was a detail I could not articulate immediately, yet it lodged itself alongside the previous incongruities. Oxford teaches patience in observation. The narrative reveals itself not in certainty, but in the juxtaposition of small, mismatched pieces. Even the inn seemed to participate in this orchestration of discrepancy. Floorboards, polished yet uneven with age, creaked in irregular intervals. Shadows shifted with deceptive angles, and the scent of damp wood mingled with the lingering aroma of coffee and tea. It was a space alive with subtle signals, and I felt the weight of both observation and expectation pressing gently. By evening, the accumulation of these minor anomalies had begun to coalesce into a faint pattern. A misquoted verse, a smudged ledger, a misaligned musical note, a hesitant gesture, all of these, individually trivial, now suggested a narrative that diverged from the surface story Lewis had pursued. The first false resolution, neat and tidy, had begun to fracture under the weight of discrepancy. In Oxford, the ordinary is seldom wholly ordinary. The discordant details, those discrepant notes, often illuminate more than the most carefully constructed narrative ever could. It is in listening, watching, and waiting that truth begins its quiet insistence. It was in the inn's small, dimly lit library that I first understood the weight of absence, the way what is not immediately visible can shape understanding more profoundly than what is. Among the shelves, I discovered a volume whose spine bore the faint imprint of a previously removed letter. The book was modest, unassuming, yet the careful tracing of pencil on one page suggested deliberate concealment of a diary entry almost forgotten, detailing an incident from years earlier. The deceased had recorded an argument over an altered manuscript, noting names that had long since faded from contemporary conversation, yet which now seemed to haunt the margins of present events. I read the page twice, aloud only to the shadows, noting the subtle phrasing that hinted at both resentment and regret. There was a mention of a fleeting alliance, a promise broken, and a manuscript that had vanished from its usual place in the college archives. The details were fragmentary, oblique, yet they lent a texture to the inn's recent events, a latent tension that had been simmering far longer than anyone could have imagined. Such fragments, I reflected, are often more telling than clear confessions. They exist precisely at the edge of consciousness, waiting for the patient observer to notice. Lewis moved among the shelves, collecting information from the inn's modest catalogue and staff recollections. I observed him while continuing to trace the diary's implications, noting how even minor gestures betray unconscious truths. A clerk's casual mention of a forgotten rehearsal room, a subtle hesitation when asked about the deceased's habits, suggested that memory and omission often coexist uneasily. In these silences, one learns far more than in spoken words. Later, in a narrow corridor where the late afternoon light struck only intermittently, I discovered an old photograph, slightly dog-eared and hidden behind a frame. It depicted a younger version of the deceased, alongside several college colleagues whose presence was now almost mythic in memory. The expressions captured pride, rivalry, veiled amusement resonated with the diary entry, hinting at tensions and loyalties that had persisted unseen. Such images carry an emotional freight, the kind that is rarely acknowledged openly, yet shapes behavior with subtle insistence. Returning to the lounge, I allowed the room's subdued noise to accompany reflection. The faint scrape of chairs, the irregular tick of the clock, the soft murmur of conversation from a corner table. Small observations that had seemed inconsequential before an errant page, a misaligned rug, the tilt of a guest's head began to cohere into a lattice of motive and association. The deceased's past, carefully chronicled yet partially concealed, was emerging as the skeleton key to understanding the present tension within the inn. I paused at a side table where a sheet of music had been set aside. One measure bore a faint pencil annotation, almost erased, its subtle adjustment suggesting a hand returning to correct, to conceal, or perhaps to signal. In combination with the diary and photograph, the notation revealed a network of past interactions, rivalries, and grudges, a delicate architecture upon which current events were built. The ordinary surfaces of the inn, polished and quiet, hid these traces as surely as a library shelf conceals a missing volume. By the time I stepped into the corridor again, the evening air had begun to cool, carrying with it the faint scent of rain on stone. I felt, as I so often do in Oxford, that the past is never truly past. It persists, folded into gesture, glance, and shadow, shaping the present in ways subtle but undeniable. The threads I had begun to unravel suggested that the forthcoming resolution, whenever it arrived, would be less a product of circumstance than the culmination of histories long concealed, waiting patiently for recognition. And so the inn remained, quietly expectant, its walls bearing witness to both what had been and what was about to unfold, a repository of secrets and small truths that demanded only careful attention to reveal themselves. By late afternoon, the case had acquired the sort of apparent clarity that is almost always dangerous. The disillusioned composer, whose habits and associations had seemed merely eccentric at first, now appeared to fit the narrative that had been quietly circulating. There was the late-night rehearsal, the disputed ledger entries, the faint, inexplicable smudge of ink, all seemingly pointing toward him. Lewis, with an earnestness that was endearing if occasionally perilous, had begun to pursue this lead with quiet determination. On paper, it was compelling, and for a moment I could understand the appeal of a neat resolution. Yet the composer's composure, that careful orchestration of gestures and glances, suggested premeditation or perhaps merely the skill of a man accustomed to observation. I noticed how his fingers traced patterns along the edge of a piano, a subconscious measure of tension, and how his eyes, when he believed them unobserved, flitted toward the corridor leading to the service entrance. Minor behaviors, subtle and easily missed, often illuminate more than overt actions, and this was one such moment. A slip of the tongue, almost imperceptible, drew my attention. He described the previous evening in precise detail, emphasizing the timing of rehearsals, and who had been present. Yet the way he lingered on certain names, pausing just long enough to suggest both calculation and omission, suggested the presence of a concealed agenda. I filed the observation quietly, recognizing that the human mind often misleads itself when it constructs coherence too readily. Later, I examined a sheet of music left in the lounge. The notes were familiar, yet a single measure appeared subtly altered, as though someone had returned to adjust it after the initial composition. The anomaly, combined with the faint pencil marks in the ledger and the composer's cautious demeanor, seemed to form a narrative too neat to be trusted. Each piece alone was trivial together. They had the seductive logic of a red herring, a pattern that invites certainty while concealing the deeper truth. Lewis had been eager to close the matter, citing the composer's opportunity and apparent motive. I allowed him his enthusiasm while I returned to observation, to patience. In Oxford, as I have often discovered, a tidy resolution frequently masks the more intricate and morally ambiguous dynamics that truly drive human action. The city has a way of whispering its complexities in the tilt of a shadow, the misalignment of a floorboard, the almost imperceptible tremor of a hand. The inn itself seemed to participate in this deception, its polished surfaces reflecting light in unpredictable angles, its corridors carrying sound in unexpected directions. A servant passed quietly, brushing a sleeve along the edge of a table, and I noticed a smudge of graphite on the corner of the countertop, faint to be noticed by any casual observer, yet suggestive of movement and intervention unseen. These small details, insignificant in isolation, now flickered with meaning against the backdrop of the composer's apparent culpability. By evening, it was clear to me that the composer, though superficially implicated, was serving as a narrative decoy, drawing attention away from subtler, more intricate threads of motive. The second red herring had accomplished its purpose, temporarily directing the focus of all concerned toward an explanation that was plausible yet incomplete. And in the quiet of the inn, with shadows lengthening across worn rugs and the faint scent of rain on stone drifting through open windows, I felt the inexorable pull of the actual narrative, hidden yet insistently present, waiting to reveal itself through observation, patience, and the faint, almost invisible cues of human behavior. It was in one of the inn's dim corridors, where light fell unevenly through the high windows and the polished floorboards reflected faintly, that the subtle connections finally began to coalesce. I had been reviewing the fragments of observation, the smudged ledger, the misaligned music note, the hesitant gestures, the cryptic letter, and in the quiet, a pattern emerged. The significance of the earlier misquotation, the erased pencil marks, and the subtle pause in speech all converged into a single, coherent thread. Lewis arrived then, speaking of his latest question, but I listened only peripherally, allowing my mind to drift through the mosaic of minor clues I had collected. There was a slight draft from a nearby door, carrying the mingled scents of old paper and damp wood, and it reminded me of a passage in one of the deceased's letters, where he had alluded to a hidden compartment in the library. The detail had seemed trivial at the time, merely decorative, but now it assumed a weight I could not ignore. I moved to the library, the familiar creak of floorboards beneath my shoes punctuating the silence. There, behind a row of unassuming volumes, I discovered what had been overlooked. A thin recess, its edges worn, containing a small folded note. It bore a phrase that mirrored the cryptic message delivered weeks earlier, its handwriting unmistakable. The note was neither accusatory nor confrontational. It simply illuminated the motives and relationships that had been obscured by the layered misdirection of events. The revelation was quiet, almost anticlimactic, yet profound. The pattern of gestures, the discrepancies in timing, the carefully cultivated distractions, all now revealed themselves as intentional, woven into a narrative that had required patient observation to perceive. The inn, its walls polished and discreetly attentive, had contained within it the evidence of human complexity, of pride, jealousy, and subtle rivalry. I noted the young historian's prior movements, now fully in context, the careful attention to floorboards and bookcases that had initially seemed nervousness or coincidence. The composer's apparent guilt, the second red herring, had drawn the surface focus, while the deeper truth lay in the patient, almost imperceptible behaviors that I had traced across days. Small gestures, easily dismissed by casual observation, had guided me toward a pattern of intent that only emerge through close scrutiny and reflective thought. A faint sound, the scrape of a chair from the lounge, reminded me of the continual presence of others, of lives intersecting with mine in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The revelation was not violent nor dramatic. It demanded neither confession nor confrontation. Instead, it required acknowledgement, a quiet comprehension of the interplay of motives, history, and opportunity. In Oxford, as I have often learned, the loudest truths are rarely spoken, and the smallest details carry the weight of consequence. Returning to the corridor, I allowed the light to fall across the polished floor, reflecting the elongated shadows of guests moving unknowingly through the inn. I catalogued each gesture and hesitation in my mind, noting how the subtle adjustment of a chair or the soft intake of breath could indicate alignment or dissent, confirmation or concealment. These were the markers of truth, embedded in ordinary behavior, detectable only by patience and attentiveness. By evening, I understood that the quiet revelation had shifted the trajectory of the investigation. The narrative, once obscured by apparent certainty and deliberate misdirection, now stood illuminated by observation, inference, and the attentive reading of human nuance. There would still be questions unanswered, threads incomplete, but the core of the pattern was clear, insistent without fanfare. In the dim corridors of the King's Arms, the subtle truths of pride, secrecy, and human folly had revealed themselves, quietly and inevitably, to the one who had taken the time to notice. The evening settled over the King's Arms with the slow inevitability of Oxford twilight, a subdued light that softened edges and lengthened shadows. I found the culprit alone in the parlor, a room where polished wood absorbed sound and the faint scent of lingering tea mingled with old varnish. There was no dramatic entrance, no hurried accusation, only the quiet presence of a man whose composure, though carefully maintained, bore the subtle tremor of apprehension. I had watched him over days, cataloguing the small gestures, the pauses, the almost imperceptible tension in his hands. I spoke gently, recounting the observations that had led me here, not in accusation but in quiet illumination. The faint pencil marks in the ledger, the smudged notation in the music, the hesitation at the service entrance, the carefully concealed photograph. Each item, trivial in isolation, now formed a lattice that framed motive, opportunity, and intent. As I spoke, I noted the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the brief tightening around the mouth that betrayed acknowledgement without surrender. He tried to deflect, suggesting coincidence, the usual misinterpretation of circumstances, yet the smallest details betrayed him. A chair slightly ajar, a book protruding more than the rest, the subtle indentation of a floorboard where he had lingered, these were the evidence that spoke louder than words. I observed them quietly, cataloguing each movement as one might examine brushstrokes on a familiar painting, noting the interplay between intention and oversight. The narrative, once obscured by red herrings and apparent resolutions, unfolded with a precision that required no dramatics. The composer, the young historian, the letter, the diary page had served to misdirect, to frame expectation. But the truth, composed of gestures, hesitation, and the faintest discrepancies, now revealed itself in this quiet room, illuminated by observation rather than confrontation. I listened to his explanation, measured, controlled, yet underlined by a faint undercurrent of pride and fear. He did not shout, did not plead, but the cadence of his words, the rhythm of his respiration, and the subtle contraction of muscles spoke volumes. I had learned long ago that human behavior often conveys more than narrative intent. The truth that matter are almost always embedded in silence, in the spaces between sentences. A final, almost imperceptible gesture, A finger brushing along a ledger, a fleeting glance toward a music sheet, confirms the alignment of past observations. I noted the sequence without comment, allowing him to fill the silence with whatever defenses he wished.